Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. This is Politico Live. My name is Bjarke Smith-Meyer, and you've arrived at our last session today, but don't worry, we've got a cracker for you. This month is not only the second annual Competitiveness Europe Summit that we've done, but it also marks the very first weeks of our next interviewee, the newly appointed Secretary General of the OECD, Matthias Cormann. Welcome to Matthias. But before we begin, our presenting partner, the Polish Economic Institute, would like to provide some opening remarks, and I'll pass the floor to Peter Arak to do so. Peter, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. I'm going to talk about taxation. So nobody likes to pay them, but it is they that create the value of public services, goods, of the scientific breakthroughs that we have, even the schools that we go to. Taxes, after all, are dues that we pay for the privileges of a membership in an organized society. That is what Franklin Delano Roosevelt once said, and I must agree. But our societies are currently very much interlinked, intertwined all around the globe. As the Polish Economic Institute, we would like to beat the global tax drum. The race to the bottom is over. According to our research, we could gain approximately $700 billion if 3 different tax types could be introduced all around the globe. They are described in this paper, Global Taxes in the post-COVID-19 era. Thanks to this amount of money, we could have everybody in the globe vaccinated 4 times. We could also hire additional 55 million nurses, so much needed in this current pandemic. We could also reach one of the many of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals that we all agree on. The $695 billion of additional tax revenues could be gained thanks to a minimum global corporate tax, a wealth tax, and a climate tax. At the same time, they would help to diminish the externalities of the current tax systems that we see, tax evasion, profit shifting, carbon leakage, and help to limit the anomalies we see of the climate in the 2020 and 2021. The first tax, so the global corporate minimum tax, is already discussed at the OECD and at the G20 forum. We seem to be very close of getting a deal that everybody agrees on. This corporate income tax could gain the world, economies around the world, approximately $115 billion. If it would be supplemented by a digital tax, it will mean approximately $127 billion of additional revenue for the public finances all around the globe. The second proposal concerns the wealthiest. They benefited the most during the pandemic. In 2020, wealth of the billionaires around the globe increased by $5 trillion just in 1 year. Adopting a wealth tax, which I'm not going to discuss very much here, is creating or could create a 285.9 additional revenues for the public finances. The third proposal concerns the global carbon tax. We propose creating 17 climate clubs grouped according to their socio-economic development and the level of CO2 emissions. We estimate that the resulting increases of revenue could be of almost 300 billion US dollars. The OECD has been a leading force bringing everybody to the tax table. A few years ago, it seemed unimaginable to have any global taxes. Currently, we have the G7 and probably the OECD agreeing on a global corporate income tax. We should not stop here. Let's beat the global tax drum. Let's build on the corporate income tax agreement and build more resilient public finances around the globe. Let's help countries repay the pandemic debt. I hope the OECD is going to play the leading role in providing an inclusive and transparent tax solutions for the whole globe. We're about to make the first step. Let's not be afraid to make the second and the third one. Thank you very much. I hope this is going to be a great interview. Cheers to you all.
Thank you, Peter. I hope it'll be a great interview too. So thanks for your words of encouragement there. Thanks again, Peter, for that. Before we get into the discussion, I just would like to remind you all that you can submit questions via the Swapcard app in the questions box next to the live stream. And to join the discussion and tweet about this event, you can use the hashtag Politico competition. Moving then on to the main event. Welcome again, Matthias Cormann, to our discussion here. As Peter just sort of outlined, all the sort of challenges that you'll have to deal with in your next term. I think one of the things that we have the advantage of talking about right now is the ongoing OECD discussions behind closed doors in a bid to try and introduce this global tax deal tomorrow for G20 countries to sign off on in a couple of weeks' time. And I would be remiss to not take advantage of you being here and just asking you, how's it going?
My video is here.
I think we've. Oh wait, there he is. Oh no, wait.
I'm here.
So we might be having some technical difficulties, but we do have Matthias back. Welcome back, Matthias. I don't know if you heard the question, but I'll just repeat it then, just in case you haven't.
Yeah, I did. Yep, no, I heard it all.
Oh, you heard it. Okay. Well, the floor is yours. Please do give us an update on how the OECD talks are going on taxation.
Well, look, clearly, just to take a step back, governments around the world, of course, have to raise revenue to fund the important public services that people around the world expect the governments to provide, from access to health, access to education, national security, infrastructure, welfare support. And it's important for the governments around the world to be able to raise those taxes in a way that is as efficient, least distorting of economic growth as possible, while also being fair and equitable. And what's been happening in recent times in the context of globalization, first was, of course, very aggressive tax planning and a level of multinational tax avoidance, which was addressed initially through the BEPS action plan led by the OECD. And of course, the combined effects of the digitalization and the globalization of the economy also created distortions and inequities where significant beneficiaries, big businesses around the world that were able to generate profits in markets all around the world were not paying tax in those markets where they were generating those profits. So over the last couple of years, the OECD has led a significant effort to try and find a multilaterally agreed solution to this. A couple of weeks ago, the G7 finance ministers, of course, reached a political agreement around two pillars, which was both of course, focused on ensuring that digital companies and large companies, very significant companies, pay their fair share of tax in markets in which they generate profits, but also that to introduce as part of a pillar two, a minimum level of global taxation, which was set by G7 finance ministers at least 15%. Now, what's been happening in recent weeks is that through the OECD G20 sponsored inclusive framework, 139 countries and jurisdictions have been talking through the detail on how this can now be finalized into an international agreement, which will ensure fair and equitable levels of taxation. And I mean, those discussions are ongoing. I'm not going to provide a specific update, but except to say that I remain, as I have been, quietly optimistic that the momentum is there to reach a landing ultimately, hopefully, at the G20 finance ministers meeting in Venice, in a couple of weeks' time.
Great. No, thanks for that. I think, okay, I mean, I appreciate that you can't necessarily give us a live feed on what's going on behind closed doors right now, and fair enough for that. But I mean, there have been some concerns over specifically the Pillar 2 initiative of introducing a minimum corporate effective tax rate of 15%. Specifically from European countries, to name a few, Ireland and Hungary are among the sort of group of countries that are a little bit concerned. Now, of course, the Pillar 2 agreement is something that countries are free to sign up on. What's your call to these European countries? They might be a little bit skeptical about the initiative itself.
Well, I'm not going to give public advice to member countries of the OECD. But what I would say, of course, is that it's important to have the right balance. I mean, there is, of course, an important place for legitimate tax competition between different countries based on the level of fiscal discipline or the different choices countries make about tax mix between indirect and direct taxes. But it is a matter of balance, and it's important that there be a floor under the level of tax competition, and that is really what is being discussed and what is being sought to be agreed here. Some multinational companies in the past have been able to structure their affairs such that they paid very little or no tax, and outside their own jurisdiction, and that is just not acceptable. It's not fair. It's not equitable. It's not sustainable moving forward, given the demands on governments around the world to provide services and support to their population. So it's a matter of getting the balance right. It's a matter of making sure the system is fair and equitable, that businesses pay the right amount of tax in the right places, but also to leave sufficient space for legitimate tax competition based on good policy choices and indeed, different approaches to the tax policy mix.
The 15% target is quite low from what a lot of NGOs say. Among academics as well, for instance, they always say that 15% is a little bit too low. Do you feel that the OECD might be the right platform to try and introduce future initiatives where we then raise that floor?
Well, what is really important here is that we have a multilaterally agreed solution. And, in the end, 15% might be too low in the eyes of some, but it's certainly higher than zero. I think that there is a value and there's a premium on having an agreement here that is consistently applied on an international basis, where ideally all 139 countries of the inclusive framework ultimately feel comfortable enough to join into a consensus. What might be the policy discussion in the future is a matter for the future. But if we were able to reach a consensus in the next little while around a floor, a minimum level of global corporate taxation of 15%, and of course also reach an agreement in relation to the digital businesses and the consumer-facing businesses, large businesses generating profits in markets all around the world, then I think that is a very significant step forward. 80% of something is always better than 100% of nothing. Indeed, I would say 50% of something is better than 100% of nothing. And I would just caution those that are pushing for higher ambition at this point in time. In the end, it's going to be very important to reach an agreement that is going to be realistically achievable.
Okay, all right. Moving on, we've now touched on digitalization and the role that taxation can play in that. Obviously there are other issues that we need to tackle as part of the post-pandemic recovery. What are the biggest challenges that you see as part of that ahead?
Well, as we seek to optimize the strength and the quality of the post-COVID recovery, the number one economic policy priority, as well as priority in terms of protecting people's health moving forward, is to get as many people around the world as possible vaccinated, to get as many people around the world as possible vaccinated as soon as possible. It's not, I don't believe the challenge necessarily is money. I think there's a lot of goodwill and a lot of preparedness to put more money into this and behind this. I think the challenge very practically is the need to increase and improve production capacity and to improve the supply chains and the distribution capabilities. And it's something that we need to do as soon as we can. And beyond that, of course, there are going to be a whole range of other challenges, getting the fiscal policy judgments right, when to transition from elevated crisis level support into a more, transition back into the new normal, and when to start, to carefully and cautiously adjust policy settings in order to start repairing budgets and balance sheet for whatever might come our way down the track.
Shouldn't climate change also play a big part of this?
Well, of course. Climate change was a global challenge before the pandemic. It was a global challenge during the pandemic, and it will be a global challenge, after the pandemic. And there's no question that we need to do everything we can to reach global net zero by 2050 at the latest. And this is something that, the same as taxation, international taxation, it is something that will need a globally coordinated effort. This can only be effectively addressed in a way that is globally coordinated, where every country around the world puts in a proportionate effort towards the overall mission of getting to global net zero as soon as possible.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's an interesting discussion. I mean, you'll forgive me to say that as part of the OECD race to take over from the previous Secretary General, some of the criticism that was leveled at your candidacy was the fact that there was this question as to the policies that the Australian government, while you were in it, were doing enough to fight climate change. And there were accusations that you might not fully get behind the idea of fighting climate change. So just to settle those accusations, I'll just ask you very flatly, are you a climate change skeptic?
No, those accusations were wrong. They were always wrong. And I mean, I would put it to you, if I had not been able to credibly dispel those false accusations, I would not have been selected as Secretary General of the OECD. I have always been committed to ambitious and effective action on climate change. But let's also be very clear. Ambitious and effective action on climate change means that we need to actually make decisions in individual jurisdictions in individual parts of the world that help solve the problem. You need to take action in a way that is environmentally effective, that is economically responsible, and that is publicly supported over time. And when I say environmentally effective, it means that making decisions in one country that just pushes emissions and activity and jobs into other jurisdictions where for the same level of economic output, emissions are going to be higher. That leaves the global environment worse off at the same time as leaving your own economy and your own people worse off in terms of the employment market. So what we need to do here is be entirely pragmatic. There is a mission to be achieved. There's an objective to be achieved. We've got to recognize that different countries around the world have different starting positions, face different circumstances, and have different opportunities to make the best possible contribution to the overall objective of reducing global emissions. And we need to have a very sensible conversation about this. Mm-hmm. This is not going to be a one-size-fits-all approach. Yes, there's got to be global coordination, but there's also going to be a recognition that different parts of the world will be able to make a better impact using different policy mixes. And my pitch to the OECD has been, and I guess I'm putting it to you now, is that we need to take some of the political rhetoric and some of the name calling out of this debate. We need to focus on actual outcomes as well as promises. We need to focus on what delivers the best possible outcomes in a given set of circumstances. And quite frankly, we need to improve the data that is available to genuinely, in an objectively comparable way, generally track the impact and the outcomes achieved based on different policy measures. And that is where the OECD can play a substantial role in really presenting and reporting on comparative, objectively comparable standardized data in terms of outcomes achieved based on different policy methodologies. One, which will, it'll help improve performance because of the scrutiny it will enable on the performance and the contribution of different countries, but also because it will help us provide better quality advice to countries around the world on how they can improve their own contributions to the overall effort.
One of the big policy initiatives that will be coming out of the EU is this, what we're calling the carbon border adjustment mechanism, or for the sake of us laymen here, we can say the carbon border tax or levy, take your pick. Australia, as well as the US, has been quite critical of this initiative and said that it wouldn't actually be able to comply with the World Trade Organization rules. Where do you stand on that? Do you think that the carbon border tax is the correct way to go ahead?
Well, I've been on the record for some time, not dissimilar to the US climate envoy John Kerry, who, of course, is clearly totally committed to ambitious and effective action on climate change. I would express a level of caution that this is not this does not just become a protectionist trade measure, which will make the global recovery more difficult, because we have further and additional pressure put into our trading system at the worst possible time as we seek to maximize or optimize strength of the recovery. What I would say is, and I think the people in Europe that I speak to say this too, this should absolutely just be a last resort. It would be much preferable if countries all around the world could be persuaded to make a genuine and proportionate effort towards achieving the global mission to get to global net zero by 2050. If we did have to go down this path, we'd have to be very careful that we make judgments on where to calibrate that price based on proper data and information that adequately and appropriately compares the efforts made in different jurisdictions, considering that different jurisdictions are using different policy methodologies. I mean, unless there is a proposition that there is a one-size-fits-all approach, and if you don't do it this way, then we're going to, impose a particular level of tax on you, which I think would be very difficult to make that WTO compliant, that sort of approach. I mean, unless that is the approach, then I think that there is a bit of homework to be done before we can go down this path to properly quantify and to properly standardize information about the efforts in different jurisdictions towards, achieving the necessary emissions reductions around the world.
You mentioned earlier on that one thing that we would have to be careful about as jurisdictions move towards tackling climate change is that industries could suddenly shift outside of that jurisdiction and then start doing their activities elsewhere. I mean, the carbon border tax is specifically designed in order to prevent this. So how do you square that? I mean, if you think that we should be careful about the carbon border tax, but you've already stated the fact that there could be a shift of industries, how do we deal with those two?
Yeah, no, well, it's a very fair question, and I mean you're quite right. I mean the border carbon adjustment mechanism. It's certainly true that what that is seeking to adjust is the problem that Australia faced some years ago when there was a clear carbon leakage risk that was eventuating. So I mean I understand the problem that is being sought to be addressed here, of course. And in an ideal world, we would have a consistently applied. Appropriately comprehensive global agreement to price emissions. But I mean, that so far hasn't been achievable. And if you had an appropriately comprehensive global agreement to price emissions on a consistent basis without competitiveness distortions and without carbon leakage risk, then of course, I mean, that would be in theory the most efficient way to go about things. But given that that is not the situation, and given that different countries around the world have found different ways of making their best contribution, whether that is through direct investment in renewable energy, whether that's through regulations, through subsidies, through competitive grant schemes, you name it. You need to find a way to fairly and equitably compare those efforts in a standardized fashion before applying punitive measures that in reality might not be justified once you consider what is actually being done in different jurisdictions around the world.
All right, thanks for that. Moving into a subject which you probably are familiar with, given the fact that you were Finance Minister of Australia beforehand. If we talk about state-owned enterprises, the one thing that I would love to ask you is, what risks does Europe face from this? We're specifically talking about Chinese state-owned enterprises. I mean, what kind of risks does that type of business have on a fair economic world platform?
Well, I don't think it's helpful to, point the finger at a specific country in this context. I mean, the truth is that state-owned enterprises, irrespective of which state owns them, has got a different context in which it operates. I mean, if you're a private sector business operating in a market-based economy, pursuing a for-profit motive, your commercial decision-making is going to be subject to different considerations. And when you are, part of if you're a state-owned enterprise owned by a government, which might have other strategic and public policy considerations that come into play in the judgments that are made by that company. And so when you have a state-owned enterprise from whatever country, that is competing with a private sector business in a market-based economy, then clearly there are potential pressure points there that need to be properly assessed, properly resolved, and there's got to be processes to ensure, that there is a proper level playing field for the businesses that are competing, under the normal commercial disciplines.
No, I'll touch on that in just a second, but maybe you could help educate me. I mean, other than China, where do we find state-owned enterprises?
Well, I was finance minister in Australia, and I was the minister for state-owned enterprises in Australia. So I think you'll find that there are state-owned enterprises in countries all around the world, and state-owned enterprises, whichever the country ultimately, will have considerations other than the immediate for-profit motive. Now, in Australia, as it happens, government business enterprises were expected, I hasten to add, to operate, commercially. But there are state-owned enterprises. I would suggest in many, if not most, if not all, countries all around the world.
Fair play, fair play. The one thing that is very topical in the EU right now is the EU's 800 billion euro recovery fund, which obviously means that a bunch of EU money straight out of Brussels is going into projects around to try and make our economy more green and more digital. Should the Commission introduce some kind of screening process that basically means that any state-owned enterprise, whether from China or a different country, is barred from working on that project?
Well, look, I'm not going to make blanket statements like this. I'm sure that the Commission is very carefully considering on how they're going to be able to get best possible value as they seek to invest, in Europe's future growth and success and a clean and green and sustainable recovery. I'm sure that all of the necessary systems are in place to ensure that money is allocated into the greatest possible impact and effect.
And you don't have any general advice? You can always give advice, right?
Well, we give our advice in structured fashion, and my advice would be to ensure that the funds are invested to get the best bang for their buck, to future-proof Europe, to future-proof Europe in a way that facilitates green, clean, sustainable, inclusive recovery and growth.
Fair enough. The one thing that I'd love to just touch on very briefly before we have to close is World Trade Organization reform. This can be a little bit of a touchy subject because China, which joined the group in 2001, obviously operates strongly underneath the idea of state sponsorship. Is that compatible then, given with the reform efforts that we're hoping to introduce?
Well, look, firstly, the world needs a rules-based global trading system, and clearly, OECD member countries, we are in favour and support and want to advance open markets and fair and free and fair trade. And in order for trade to be free and fair, we've got to have, to the greatest extent possible, a global level playing field. We've got to have rules of the game that are expected to the greatest extent possible by everyone, and where any breaches with those rules, compliance can be, there can be dispute resolution and compliance enforced. So the World Trade Organization plays an incredibly important role in that context. It's very important that the World Trade Organization is as effective as possible in that very important role. There are some obvious and well-publicized tensions that have played out in recent years, and to the extent that we can, we will do everything we can to help resolve those tensions moving forward. That the principle has got to be that there's got to be agreement on the rules of the game, and that is very important, in particular for smaller and middle-sized and for developing economies around the world, and then countries around the world have to comply with them.
Great. Thank you so much for that. Thank you very much, Secretary General, for taking time today. I understand you also have another commitment now, so I'll let you go. And thank you very much once again for being here today. It was a great discussion.
Thank you.
We managed to dive into the fact that maybe we should first introduce a minimum corporate taxation rate of 15%, which is better than nothing, and then we can talk about maybe increasing that later. The Secretary General also made sure to caution any EU plans to introduce a carbon border tax, and then of course you just heard the final comments there on the World Trade Organization reform. That is it. I'm afraid that we've come to the end of the summit. Thank you all very much for watching. We've hoped that you've enjoyed these past 2 days of conversation that took place, and that you were able to connect with other attendees virtually. I would again like to thank our presenting partners, that's at the CEFIC, CISSP, Generali, Google, and the Polish Economic Institute, as well as our supporting organizations, the German Council on Foreign Relations and Europe Jacques Delors, for making this event possible. I'd also like to thank the journalists who also took part here and made the events and the discussions really engaging. We have many more events with the world's leading policymakers, academic, industry players, and civil society representatives coming. We'll be presenting Politico's Tech 28 on July 8th. Which will shine a spotlight on the 28 most influential voices in the tech sector, featuring an interview with former Denmark Prime Minister and compatriot Helle Thorning-Schmidt. Make sure that you check out, along with our other future events on the Politico Live page. Our next Competitive Europe Summit will take place again next year around the same period. And with that, I thank you very much for watching Politico Live. My name is Bjarke Smith-Meyer, and have a wonderful evening.